Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your Bio 182 Lecture 7.2 on Deuterostome Animals. If you guys remember from our previous lecture, a deuterostome is an organism where the anus forms before the mouth. So it's anus first and then mouth. Within the deuterostomes, there are two groups. There are the echinoderms, which we talked about a little bit in lab, and there are the chordates, which we're going to do a little bit more in detail here. So the previous phylogenetic tree was a little bit of a simplified version, as usual, and of course, of what we see within the echinoderms and the chordates. So again, those are the two groups that are considered deuterostomes. There are a lot of deuterostomes. If we look back at the fossil record, there's a lot of deuterostomes that have gone extinct, and some of them are very, very similar to animals that are still alive today. What we're going to do in today's lecture is first go through echinoderms in a little bit more detail, and then through chordates. And it's going to seem a little bit crazy because we're going to blow through all of these different groups so quickly, when in reality, a lot of these are the things that you normally think of as animals. And so we're going to go through all of this evolution in animals so fast, when in reality, it's covering like 500 million years of evolution. So we're going to start by talking about the echinoderms. So we're going to start with the echinoderms. This group is called echinoderms because of the spiny surfaces on the organisms. This group includes things like sea stars, sand dollars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, also things like sea lilies, small little marine animals like that. All of these members of this group lack body segments. They usually have an endoskeleton. They have a water vascular system that facilitates gas exchange and waste disposal. And this group fits into the bilateria, which can be confusing because they actually have pentaradial symmetry as adults. But if you look at their larvae, their larvae are have bilateral symmetry. And so because of the larval form, we are able to put them into the bilateria instead of the radiata. The next group are the chordates. So there are four major characteristics of all chordates. The first is a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a notochord, there are pharyngeal slits, and a postanal tail. With the dorsal hollow nerve cord, this is different from the nerve cord that arthropods have because theirs is a ventral nerve cord. A notochord is a hard rod that goes along the back of the organism and allows in movement while swimming. The pharyngeal slits were originally used to get food, but they have over time evolved into different structures and different functions. And the postanal tail just means that the tail protrudes past the anus of the organism. Not all chordates have all of these characteristics, and they don't have all of them at the same time. There are some where we see these only in the embryonic stage and then they go away. There is the group that's the Urochordata, and they actually don't have any of these as adults. They've gone through a reversal and lost all of these characteristics, but they have them in their larval stage. So these are not characteristics that we see necessarily in the adult form, but at some point in development, all chordates have these characteristics. So again, we had on the previous slide a sort of simplified version of the chordata phylogeny, and here we have an expanded version that shows a lot more detail and a lot more of what's actually going on in that phylum. So anytime that you are looking at a phylogenetic tree and you see that sort of dagger shape, it looks like a cross at the end of that group, it means that that has gone extinct. So on this tree, you can actually see a lot of different places where that species or that group or that class has gone extinct, which just means that evolution did not select for the traits that they had, or they were outcompeted, or there was some event that caused their extinction. So within the chordata, there's been a lot of evolution and a lot of extinction that's gone on since the beginning of the chordata. Anything on here that has a star on it is something that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. So some of these you have gone over in lab, but some of them you have not seen before. And so we will start our discussion with the cephalochordata. So the cephalochordata are a group that are considered invertebrate chordates. They're considered invertebrates because they don't have a hard backbone. They have that notochord, but no hard vertebra on their back. They have all four of the chordate characteristics. They are small filter feeders, and they go by the common name of lancelets. The next group are the tunicates. These are also invertebrate chordates, and this is one of the groups that has gone through an evolutionary reversal. They don't have a backbone, and they possess all four of the chordate characteristics as larvae, but as adults, they are sessile, so they just stay in one spot. They have a very simple feeding mechanism. They have no eyes, they have no brain, none of that stuff. They're just very simple organisms as adults. The next group are the agnatha. These are the hagfish and the lampreys. This is the first group that are considered vertebrates because they actually do have a backbone, and they evolved about 540 million years ago. Agnatha means no jaw. So these are fish that have no jaws. They just have suckers with sort of like teeth-like structures that are useful in the way that they eat. So lampreys are external parasites on other fish. So if you go fishing and you pull something out of the water and it has little sucker fish attached to it, they're possibly lampreys. And if you look at the mouth structure on the lampreys, which is shown on the left side of your screen, you can see that it's sort of a sucker, and you can see those teeth structures which help them cling to the side of the fish while they suck the fluids from whatever they're parasitizing. Hagfish are also agnatha, and they are the first organisms to have a skull. So that just means that they have a bony structure that is protecting their brain. And they have these glands along the sides of their bodies that produce slime, and it protects them from predators. So if something were to try to attack them, they would let slime out of their body, which is what this guy is holding in the picture down at the bottom of the screen. They would exude this slime, and it sort of chokes whatever predator is trying to attack them so that the hagfish can get away. And these guys eat rotting carcasses. Most of the time it's like rotting whale carcasses and things like that in the ocean. The next group are the chondrichthyes, which are the cartilaginous fishes. These guys evolved about 541 million years ago. And they have a few important evolutionary traits. The first would be jaws. So they actually have jaws, that they have teeth that they can use to bite things. They have paired appendages, and they have a skeleton made of cartilage. So this is the beginning of fins and things like that that allow them to move quickly through the water. And these traits allow them to become the predators that they are. So a lot of the diversity of the chondrichthyes has been lost through evolution, and we can see evidence of them in the fossil record. But there are two groups that are left. There are the elasmobranchs, which are the sharks and rays, and there are the holocephali, which are the chimeras. The next group of fish to evolve are what we call the osteoichthyes. These are the bony fishes. This is a really big group, and it includes fish like salmon and goldfish and things like that. And as a monophyletic group, it also coincidentally includes the tetrapods, which we are part of. So we are evolutionarily the descendants of early osteoichthyes. Some of the important traits for the osteoichthyes are that they are a chordate with jaws, and they have a skeleton that is made of bone tissue or calcium, not cartilage. So the fact that it's made out of bone tissue instead of cartilage means that they have a lot more flexibility, and it's a lot easier for them to move and maneuver through the water. The earliest known bony fish fossil that we have is called Guioaniros. I'm sure I'm butchering that a little, and that's my bad. But these guys lived during the late Silurian period, so about 419 million years ago. And we think that it has a combination of both ray-finned and lobe-finned features, although it looks a little bit more like a lobe-finned fish. Within the osteoichthyes, there are two subgroups or two subsets of this type of fish. There are the Actinopterygii and the Sarcopterygii, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. So the Actinopterygii are the ray-finned fish, and these are nearly 99% of the 30,000 species of fish that are ray-finned. And so most of the fish in the ocean that you think about, or in a lake or wherever, are ray-finned fish. And they're called ray-finned because their fins branch out directly from their sides rather than attaching to a limb like their cousins, which are the Sarcopterygii. And so if you look at the lanternfish, which is in the middle row all the way to the left, you can see that their fins sort of jut straight out from their bodies. And so fins on a fish are not just used for swimming. They can be used for perching, whether it's on the bottom of the ocean or a pond or a lake. They can be used for sort of grasping things, but because of where they're attached, they don't have a lot of movement and a lot of ability to use them the same way that we use our hands. But you can sort of think about them as limbs that stick out from the sides of their bodies. The next group within the osteoichthyes are the Sarcopterygii, which are the lobe-finned fish. And this is the group that tetrapods, which humans are a part of, have evolved from. And so within the Sarcopterygii, there are the Actinistia, which are coelacanths, and the Dipnoi, which are lungfish. What we see happening in the evolution of coelacanths is that they no longer just have fins protruding from the side of their body. There's actually a small protrusion off the side of the fish's body with fins on the end of those. So you can see how they're sort of becoming a four-limbed animal. And there are tons of fossils of coelacanths in the fossil record, and not very long ago in human history, fishermen off the coast of South Africa actually found living coelacanths in the water, and they live very deep down in the water in the ocean, but there are still living coelacanths. They're very slow growing and pretty rare, but they are still something that we find today. So when we're thinking about the evolution of things moving onto land, the first thing that they needed to evolve was limbs, which now through coelacanths we know when in evolutionary history that happened. The next thing you need is lungs instead of gills. And the next type of Sarcopterygi, which are the lungfishes, provide evidence for the evolution of early lungs. So lungfishes are also an African species, and they have tissue that is a rudimentary lung. And so when it's the dry season and there's no water around, they burrow down into the soil and they just sort of stay there immobile and hibernating in these little sort of packets. And when it rains, they'll emerge from it, come out into the water, feed and mate and reproduce, and then they go back down into their burrow during the dry season. But they use their lungs to breathe underground when there's no water around. So in the GIF that you guys are watching, there's a young man who finds a lungfish in its burrow and in its hibernation and pulls it out of the ground. So that's actually a lungfish that's been hibernating and is using its early type of lungs to breathe air while there's no water around. And so through the coelacanths and the lungfishes, we're able to see how early land-dwelling animals could have evolved through first the evolution of these lobe fins that became limbs, and then through the evolution of simple lungs. Next, we're going to talk about the tetrapods, which are the four-legged chordates. And within that, there's two groups. There are the amphibians and the amniotes. The amphibians are broken down into three groups. There's the frogs, the salamanders, and the caecilians. All amphibians have a mixture of aquatic and terrestrial adaptations because they live part of their life in the water and part of it on land. They have lungs and skin that they use both for gas exchange, and they usually need water to reproduce since their eggs don't contain an amnion, so they generally will lay their eggs in water, and a lot of the time the larval stage or the juvenile stage will live in the water, and then the adults live on land. Some of them have a complete metamorphosis and some don't. So frogs have a complete metamorphosis where they are tadpoles and then turn into adult frogs. There are different types of salamanders that have actually had an evolutionary regression, things like the axolotls, where they get adult characteristics in their larval form and they live in the water throughout their entire life. And then there are the caecilians, which look kind of like a snake or a worm. And they don't actually need to live in the water. They just need to live in moist environments. And some of them are able to lay eggs, and some have live offspring. The next group we're going to talk about are the reptiles. This is a big group. So let's go back 2 slides. And if we look at this, so we said within the tetrapods, we had the amphibians, and then we had the amniotes. Within the amniotes, there are mammals and reptiles. And reptiles are all organisms that have eggs with an amnion in them. So the living reptile lineages are the turtles, birds, tuataras, and the squamates, which are snakes and lizards. They have different adaptations for living on land, so they have scales to help them prevent dehydration, so they're less dependent on water than the amphibians. They have lungs for breathing air, and they have an amniotic egg. And within the reptiles, we know a lot about the living reptiles, but there are actually a lot of extinct groups of reptiles, and they were pretty cool. So the first are the pterosaurs, which were flying reptiles. The next are the dinosaurs, which birds are the only type of dinosaur that survived the mass extinction event that was 66 million years ago. So dinosaurs are things like velociraptors and T-Rex and Triceratops, things like that. There were the pliosaurs, which were marine reptiles, and then there were ichthyosaurs, which were fish-like marine reptiles, and a lot of them looked like what we know as dolphins today. So birds were the only dinosaurs that survived the mass extinction event that was 66 million years ago. So birds are feathered theropod dinosaurs, and they evolved in China about 160 million years ago. There are currently about 10,000 living species of birds, and they have a lot of adaptations for a lot of different types of diet and different environments. So all birds have modifications for flight. So they all have very light bones with large air cavities, which is important for flight because they don't need the extra weight of their bones when they're trying to get in the air. They have large pectoral muscles, which help them with flight and flapping their wings. And then they have their feathers, which help in flight and thermoregulation. A lot of birds within this group, they have a lot of different modifications, and there's things like the ostrich, which is no longer a flying bird, but it's a runner instead. However, they've kept their feathers, which help them maintain thermoregulation. Next is the class Mammalia. So mammals evolved from reptile-like ancestors about 225 million years ago. The Hadrocodium is one of the oldest known mammal fossils, and it was very, very tiny. And mammals include mostly terrestrial organisms, although there are some, like whales and dolphins and things like that, that have gone back into the water. All mammals have hair, and they have mammary glands, which are glands that produce milk to feed their young. So within the mammals, there are three living groups. There are the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placental mammals. So just like every other group where I show you sort of an expanded version of the phylogeny, you can see that there's a lot of mammals that have gone extinct over time. And these are the three groups that have survived natural selection. The first group are called the monotremes, and these are egg-laying mammals. This includes echidnas and platypus. These are only found in Australia, and they're interesting mammals, not only because they lay eggs, which no other mammals do, but they have no nipples. They actually just secrete milk on a patch of skin on their belly. And so we think that the evolution of milk for offspring came from this origin, where on your body you have different glands, and some of them secrete oils when you're sweating, and some of them secrete just water and salt. And so the patches on the skin of echidnas and platypuses secrete these, and that is what the offspring sort of suck off of the patches of skin. And so you can see how if your body is already secreting water and salt and oils, it's not that hard to then add in proteins and sugars and things like that and make actual milk. And so this is sort of the beginning of that milk that mammals secrete for their offspring. And so when a monotreme mother has offspring, they have the offspring at a very early stage in embryonic development. So their offspring doesn't look like the adult form, and then that offspring will just sort of crawl along the mother's stomach and eat that secretion from the skin of the mother. The next group of mammals are the marsupials. Marsupials have young that are born in an embryonic state, and then they're kept in pouches during the rest of their development. So you can think of a marsupial mother as having essentially an egg hatch inside of her uterus, and then the embryonic offspring comes out. Marsupials just don't have a placenta, so the offspring can't stay in complete development inside of the mother. They come out and then they stay in a pouch, and then the female has nipples that the young can attach to and get milk directly from. Marsupials are found almost only in Australia, and they evolved about 100 to 120 million years ago. Within the Australian ecosystem, they actually fill a lot of different roles that are comparable to other organisms in other parts of the world. So something like a kangaroo fills a similar ecological niche to like a deer. A koala bear fills a similar ecological niche to like a sloth. A wombat is similar to a groundhog. A sugar glider is similar to a flying squirrel. Sort of the list goes on. And so they diversified in Australia, but many of them have very similar roles to things that live in other parts of the world. So marsupials were able to radiate within Australia. In the rest of the world, placental mammals became the dominant type of mammal. Placental mammals have an embryo that develops within the uterus of the female, and it receives nutrients and oxygen through the placenta, which is an organ that has both maternal and fetal origins. So the benefit of having a placenta and being a placental mammal is that the embryo can be more advanced in development when it's born. The embryo will stay in the mother for a longer period of time, which is good for things like brain development, lung development, things like that. And so when you have an offspring, it's much further along in development than you do in a monotreme or a marsupial. And so that is beneficial for the offspring, but it's a lot more costly and it's a lot more parental investment for the mother compared to having offspring the way that a marsupial does. Within the placental mammals, there are three major groups. There are the Afrotheria, the Boroeutheria, and the Xenarthra. The Afrotheria are a very diverse group, and this includes everything from elephants to hyraxes to manatees, to moles, tenrecs, things like that. The Boroeutheria are things like rodents, primates, which are humans, rabbits, bats, cats, dogs, seals, hoofed things like pigs and cattle and zebras. And the Xenarthra are armadillos, anteaters, and sloths. So the next thing we're going to do is sort of look at how primates fit into this evolution of mammals. So on the last slide, we talked about the fact that primates are Boroeutheria, and we know that primates evolved from insect-eating mammals. And the early primates were very small, and they lived in trees. There are now over 200 species of primates, and they started evolving about 40 million or so years ago. All primates have similar characteristics, which include limber shoulder joints, meaning that we can move our arms in different directions. We have eyes on the front of our face instead of pointing sort of to the sides. We have excellent hand-eye coordination, and all primates have extensive parental care. In the living primates, there are a few different categories. We first have the prosimians, which are things like lemurs and tarsiers and things like that. We then have monkeys. There are two groups. There's New World monkeys, which live in Central and South America, and Old World monkeys, which live in Africa and Asia. We then have lesser apes, which are things like gibbons. And then we have great apes, which are things like orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees, and then humans. We can use genetics and the fossil record to look at how long ago different types of primates have evolved and sort of formed different groups. So the New World monkeys evolved and branched off from the lemurs and the tarsiers and things like that about 38 million years ago. The Old World monkeys, which are things like baboons, evolved about 25 million years ago. Orangutans were about 12 million years ago, gorillas about 6 million years ago, and humans and chimpanzees branched off from each other about 5 million years ago. So within the hominidae, which are the great apes, there are 8 living species of the great apes. There's so many there are so many different species of great apes that have gone extinct that we can't even include them. It would just take over and it would be really hard to process. But the ones that are alive, there are Bornean orangutans, Sumatran orangutans, the Tanapuli orangutans. And so out of the orangutans, the Tanapuli orangutans have the fewest number of individuals left, only about 800 individuals left living today. There are 2 types of gorillas. There are the eastern gorillas, which are quite endangered, especially compared to the western gorillas, which have about 95,000 species or 95,000 individuals. The eastern gorillas are down to about 1,004 or so individuals. Common chimpanzees, there's about 200,000 chimpanzees living today. There's about 30,000 living bonobos. And then humans, we have about 7.7 billion individuals living on the planet today. Some of the characteristics for all hominids are that you have a broad nose and a broad palate. So your palate is sort of the roof of your mouth, and on your mouth it's sort of wide and flat. If you were to feel the palate of like your dog or your cat or something, it's a little bit more arched. And that's one of the characteristics of hominids, is that you have a flat, broad palate. We have simple molars. We have a larger brain compared to our body size in comparison to other species. We have an emphasis on forelimbs in locomotion. We have long arms with increased mobility at the shoulder and wrist. Hominids also have a broad trunk, meaning a broad body. We have reduced lumbar vertebrae, meaning that down by your tailbone and your coccyx, you have fewer vertebrae and they become fused together. So that means that you don't have a tail. Hominids have a greater mobility at the hip and ankle joints, which is important in walking upright. And they have an enlarged and grasping big toe, which your toe can do also. It can actually grasp things. It has a lot more mobility than the rest of your toes. So within the evolution of hominids and the events that have led to the evolution of modern humans, there have been a lot of other species of hominids that have gone extinct. So one genus that humans have evolved from are the Australopithecines. The Australopithecines have many, many different lineages that have gone extinct throughout the history of hominids. A couple of the notable ones are Ardipithecus ramidus, and so the best known fossil from that species is nicknamed Ardi. There's also Australopithecus africanus, and there's a very well-known fossil that's nicknamed Lucy, and those two in particular were unique and really good finds because they were almost complete fossils of early hominids. Other notable groups within this tree, there's the Paranthropus, which were a group that was alive around the same time as Lucy would have been, and went extinct because they were a vegetarian species of hominid. And when climate changed and made it so that vegetables and things like that did not grow as well, that group, which didn't eat meat, wasn't able to survive in the same way, and so they went extinct. Also, there is the Neanderthals, which were a much more recent group of hominids to have evolved and lived in Europe. So if you're of European descent, you actually have a decent amount of Neanderthal DNA within your DNA, because we know that they were alive at the same time as early Homo sapiens, and there was quite a bit of intermixing between the two species, and so over time what we think happened is that Homo sapiens outcompeted and possibly killed off the Neanderthals and were the winning hominid that was able to stay alive and continue on. But because there was a little bit of inbreeding between the two, if you are European, you have a decent amount of Neanderthal DNA within your genome. So to bring this back to when we were talking about speciation events and genetics and things like that, if you look at the number of chromosomes that Homo sapiens have compared to chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans have 48 chromosomes, or 24 pairs, whereas Homo sapiens have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. And it turns out, when we look at the differences between chimpanzee DNA and human DNA, what we see is that there was a fusion event between two chromosomes in the chimpanzee DNA, and it fused into one chromosome in human DNA. So chimpanzees have a chromosome 2A and chromosome 2B, but in humans, those two chromosomes fused into one to make one chromosome 2. And it's that fusion event that gives us a lot of differences that we see between us and chimpanzees and why we are so diverged from them. So when we're talking about hominids and hominina, there's a couple of defining traits for the individuals that fall into this group. The first is bipedalism, or walking on two legs, instead of walking on all fours like a dog or an elephant, things like that. And there's a lot of ways to tell if a fossil had bipedalism. So when an archaeologist says that this early human fossil had bipedalism, it's not a guess, it's based on a lot of evidence. And some of the evidence that they can use would be the position of the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the base of your skull. So if that hole where your spine connects up to your brain, if that's further up on your head, then that indicates that you likely walked on all fours. If you think about your dog, their foramen magnum would be further up on the back of their head. If it's lower down on the back of the head, it would be coming out the bottom of the skull and therefore would allow you to walk upright. There's also the curve of the vertebral column. So your spine has sort of an S-shaped curve, which allows you to stand upright. Things that are not able to stand upright have a straight vertebral column, something like a horse, something, their back is very flat. They could not walk upright for that reason, or one of those reasons. There is also, you can look at the rib cage, you can look at the pelvis and how the pelvis is shaped and how the individual's legs would come out of it, and determine from that whether or not that particular fossil would have been able to walk upright. The knees as well as the feet also have different anatomy depending on whether an individual walks upright or on all fours. Another defining trait of hominids is a large brain size compared to the rest of the individual's body. So it's a comparative look at the brain mass compared to the size of the body. And in that, we have chimpanzees with a brain that's about 360 cc's, Australopithecus, which was about 460-ish to 470 cc's, Homo erectus, which was an early Homo species, and they had brain capacity of about 900 cc's. And then modern humans have a brain capacity of about, or a brain volume of about 1200 or so cc's. And so over time, what we've seen is an evolution towards a larger brain size in hominids. So just to kind of go back and look at this in a little bit more of a simplified form. So modern humans split, or the ancestors of modern humans split from chimpanzees somewhere between 9.3 and 6.5 million years ago. There was a split between modern humans and Neanderthals about 750 to 550,000 years ago. Neanderthals were still alive as early as 40,000 years ago, and there was a lot of interbreeding going on between humans and Neanderthals. In relatively recent history, and that is why you can see Neanderthal DNA in the DNA of humans. So on the right hand of the slide, you can see sort of a progression of big events in the evolution of modern humans. So a couple things that I want you guys to pay attention to. The earliest possibly bipedal hominids would have been about 7 million years ago. Our split from chimpanzees about 6 million-ish years ago. And then the earliest use of stone tools was about 3 million years ago, which was an important advancement in the evolution of hominids. The earliest use of fire was about 1.5 to 2 million years ago. And then if you look at it, modern humans, Homo sapiens, are incredibly recently diverged in comparison to not only the evolutionary history of hominids as well as primates and the entire rest of living things on the planet. When other things go back hundreds of millions of years, modern humans have not been around for very long. So the genus Homo, which is humans, had several different species, and Homo sapiens are the ones that have sort of persisted and been able to continue on through evolution and through time. Like we've said, all hominids have large brains and are bipedal, and we think they first arose about 200 million years ago in Africa. I don't need you to know every single detail about all of these different early humans. The ones I want you to know a little bit about would be Homo erectus, and they arose about 1.9 to 140,000 years ago in Africa. And they're called Homo erectus because they are the first group that we think were able to actually stand fully upright. They're also important because they use stone tools and fire. And because they lived from 1.9 to 140,000 years ago, they actually were around for a very long time. So they had a lot of adaptations that were really beneficial for them in that environment. The other one is Homo neanderthalensis. This is the Neanderthals. They were around from about 300,000 to 40,000 years ago in Europe. They used stone tools, they did weaving, they had grave ceremonies. So they actually had a really complex culture, and they seemed to have value of human life and things like that. And we know that they interbred with Homo sapiens. And over time, Homo sapiens either killed them off or they just sort of were intermingled within the Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens emerged about 300,000 years ago in Africa, and moved out of Africa and spread throughout the rest of the world. And they interbred with the Neanderthals. And so when you think about humans, I don't want you to get the idea that humans are sort of the apex of evolution. We're no better than something like a cockroach. A cockroach has been around for about as long as humans, but they fill a different role in the environment. And if there's nothing wrong with them, there's nothing for evolution to act upon. So every species, every phyla, every group has its role in its environment. And because of that, humans have had a chance and evolutionary pressures that have allowed them to evolve to where we are now. But it does not mean in any way that humans are more evolved than any other thing on this planet.